in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Okay, welcome back to the next episode of Sapio, back here with my old friend, Alan Viglione.
Hey.
Today we're going to talk about, I guess, what we're calling our last pillar of longevity, which is social relationships. So, Alan, thanks for coming back and discussing this. This is not something that you and I know a whole lot about, but, you know, we've done a little bit of research. We've kind of looked into it. We know it's a real thing.
Oh, yeah.
But let's start with this. Like, when you think of like, you know, tribal societies, what do you think of? Like, what comes to mind in terms of like social hierarchy and, you know, so what do you think of? I'm just curious.
I'll tell you, I mean, you know, it's funny, like word association, but I think of pack animals. I think of connectedness, and I think we come together for a common goal, and that common goal is essentially survival. We all bring something to the table.
Right. So there's like this collective sort of tribal thing that I think like, and the reason I bring that up is, you know, that's ultimately how we evolved, right?
Yeah.
And that's how we're, as human beings, are sort of meant to be in many ways. We are fundamentally social creatures. We're creatures of that need each other, and if we aren't needed, we kind of we sort of just, in the same way that like if you're not, you know, if a certain feature isn't needed and throughout evolution it gets eliminated because it's just extra weight.
Well said.
People can become extra weight. And evolution kind of takes care of them itself, right? And so now if you contrast that tribal type of life, and think of like the way the world has become now, like what is it like to live in Western society now? I mean, what comes to my mind is like COVID, living in New York City in an apartment. I don't live in New York City, but, you know, working from Zoom, not having colleagues, not having social interactions, all that kind of thing. We're not meant to be
I would
like
agree.
that.
I would agree.
Right?
Evolutionarily, I mean, this is all very new.
Right.
Isolation creates, I mean, we can even see the impact of isolation. Yeah, you use COVID as an example. You know, think about like 2 to 3 years. Like, look at the impact of COVID on schools and adolescent brain development. I mean, you know, we're thinking bigger sort of in this talk, but social isolation can wreak havoc on the human mind and body.
You know, actually, and I know you were talking about a study about this that you read that relates to development. Will you talk about that study? Because I think it's a good place to start with this topic.
So, you know, the big question is, what is the impact that social isolation has on, I mean, the purpose of this talk, of this series is longevity, right? And we know that social isolation contributes to survival deficits. But the study that you're referencing, do you have the title of it?
Yeah, so this is from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is Yang et al. And the reason that I bring that up also is because, I mean, this is a real journal, right? This is real science. The name of the article is Social Relationships and Physiological Determinants of Longevity Across Human Lifespan. Tell us the significance.
So think about that. I mean, if you're going to do a longitudinal study, you're going to follow people throughout a life. We don't have 80 years to do a study. So I can tell you what I think is powerful about the study that you just mentioned is that we're tracking kids, middle-aged adults, and then also elderly people as well, with a very well-powered longitudinal study and correlating it to objectable markers. And, you know,
so tell us a little bit about what you mean there.
Yeah. So, okay. We've known for a long time that connectedness correlates very well to survival.
Or at least we've thought that to be the case.
And actually there are some studies that are very well supportive of that.
Yeah.
But nobody knows why. But what studies like this are trying to do, they're trying to identify the physiology that's actually happening.
Right.
So if we correlate connectedness via surveys, right, to objective biological markers.
Okay. So maybe you had some kids, they got sent some surveys out, and they said, to basically get a sense of where their self-reported idea of what their social connectedness was, and then over a period of time following them to figure out how that correlates with changes in their own bodies and physiology and disease and all that kind of stuff. And then they did the same thing with adults. Is that right?
So basically, I mean, the beautiful thing is that you can't just sit there and watch someone age 80 years. But what you can do is look at large trials, well-powered studies in different age groups to correlate these biological metrics to an age.
So what did they find?
Well, they found that social connectedness is ubiquitously powerful throughout, right? We knew that. But there actually are some variations that happen as we age and that are more pronounced when we're young. So social connectedness, adolescence is a very powerful time. Now, when you lack social connectedness as an adolescent, you don't have high blood pressure, right? That's an example of something that actually does happen as we age in the older ones. But truncal obesity, metabolic syndrome, these are things that actually do happen early.
So what you're saying is that these kids, at least on the kids' side, when those who were less connected were more likely to be fat. I mean, I'm just,
and that's
I mean, that's what you're talking, right? Like, truncal obesity, you can say whatever you want, but I'm just saying they're more likely to, have poor health and be overweight because they've got some sort of endocrine kind of thing going on, right? Like that's effectively what you're saying.
That's the domain that's implied here.
Right. And then what about with adults?
Well, adults need social connectedness too, without doubt. I mean, depression is astoundingly prevalent in the older populations. But one thing that I found interesting is the number of friends don't matter quite so much as the quality of your friends. You have to feel like you have a niche. And this is sort of our pack mentality. And some of that evolves with the brain as we age. I mean, when you're in high school, you need the perceived connectedness above all else. How do people visualize me? It matters more. But when you're older, what really matters most is close relationship. So implications of quality. I mean, really, so if you lack that social network, that high quality social network, and remember, these are based on surveys, and there are validated surveys. Don't get me wrong, but these are like validated surveys that look at strength of connectedness in multiple different domains too. So what happens when you're lacking quality relationships? Metabolic markers go up.
So the same thing as that happened with the kids
in a different proportion. So hypertension is higher when you lack social connectedness. CRP goes up. That's something that wasn't quite
so inflammation.
Inflammation. And really what we're thinking is that inflammation can beget multiple other processes. You can extrapolate that however you want. But inflammation is one of the foundations of cancer, malignancy. Let's revisit the domains that are being identified here. So we have hypertension, so blood pressure. So systolic and diastolic blood pressure go up when social connectedness goes down. And in adults, it's particularly quality of connectedness, right? So it's sort of like a subdomain of social connectedness. Number two, BMI goes up. So patients increase weight. And cortisol, which is sort of like an indicator of inflammation, as with CRP. Cortisol creates a metabolic imbalance. Cortisol raises blood sugar.
So cortisol went up.
Okay,
so cortisol is a stress hormone. And could potentially sort of explain all of the things that are happening in
I mean, you can tie it back to all of our other conversations. Okay,
so if you, again, so basically what you're saying is in kids and adults, poor social relationships have shown to negatively impact health. Whether in specifically, obesity, metabolic syndrome, these things. So that's, I mean, I think that's a powerful study. I mean, and it goes also with a number of other studies that are out there. And again, these types of studies are a little bit more challenging, right? Like how do you measure these kinds of things? But I think there is data. I mean, there's a meta-analysis, 148 studies here with 300,000 participants found that social integration, which includes things like marriage, involvement in social organizations, and size of the social network, was associated with 50% increased likelihood of survival over over the
I saw
period of the studies, which was, again, that's a pretty decent size study. There was also another one that showed, this was 6,000 adults. The social support, which includes measures such as emotional support, instrumental support, social interaction, was a predictor of longevity, even after controlling for factors such as age, gender, health, status, etc. You could just keep going on because there's a number of studies like this. But again, I guess what this to me comes around and I start to think, well, okay, is there some common theme to this? What happens? What happens when you have social support compared to when you don't, right? And one is like when you have social support, presumably you have a reduction in stress, right?
That's a big theme.
Reduction in stress, and that can, buffer a lot of the effect. The emotional support can buffer a lot of that stress, and we're talking about potentially decreasing cortisol levels. Levels. You want to talk about what cortisol is? Because we keep talking about this, but what is cortisol?
Cortisol is the classic stress hormone that comes out of our adrenal gland. Cortisol has hundreds of physiological functions in the body, but if you think about it in terms of one theme, it begets the fight or flight, the stress response. Pupils dilate, blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes up, blood shunts to the muscles. You kind of get the theme here.
Yeah.
And that's great if you're going to fight off a lion. It's not great if you're trying to go to sleep.
Right, exactly, or sleep, or basically it increases blood sugar, causes all sorts of other havoc. Curiously, the social interactions also tend to result in an increase in oxytocin. You want to talk about oxytocin?
Yeah, we've mentioned oxytocin before.
Yeah.
Oxytocin is the classic pair bonding hormone.
What does that mean, pair bonding?
So it actually creates connectedness. It literally creates that sense of connectedness between two individuals.
It's like the bonding, like between a mother and a child, because prolactin is what's released in the mother during lactation. Right?
Yeah, that's what most people are familiar with. Also, romantic relationships, oxytocin goes up to form that sense of connectedness. Parents and children, and even friends. I mean, oxytocin creates, it's really sort of like, it's called the love hormone by some gurus. But that's what it does. I mean, and physiologically, it creates contractions in the uterus, but it also antagonizes
and
cortisol.
Actually antagonizes cortisol, which I think is really interesting, which could be sort of at the core of the physiological response across the board that we're seeing. You also have immune system support. The study suggests that social interaction can support the immune system, which is obviously important for health and longevity. And so and when you think about it, the immune system support, you also obviously have to think about cancer. You've got neuroendocrine regulation, which you've kind of suggested before. Again, that could also be hampered by the cortisol release and stuff. Basically, you've got an alteration in hormones, right? So bad social situations where you don't have like connections and stuff like that lead to stress or the inability to cope with stress, therefore increasing the levels of cortisol, which creates all these other potential problems.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. And remember too, we're not talking about an acute response. We're not talking about someone coming home from school being bullied and being stressed. We're talking about long-standing changes that ultimately can implicate to mortality.
Right. Absolutely. And this is stuff that there's a book called Blue Zones. I think it's Dan Buettner wrote, and he also noticed, like, he was in blue zones are basically these parts of the world where people seem to live for a longer period of time. There's a lot more centenarians there. They tend to be healthier into older age. And a common theme that he found throughout those studies and his travels was ultimately that in these places like Okinawa or like Sardinia, they all had these really close social interactions. They had a purpose for the elderly, which,
Yeah.
I think,
think that's
again,
spot
in
on.
most of Western society, it's sort of, kids leave, they move all over the place, and, then you've got these elderly, and hopefully they've got some hobbies and friends, but if they don't,
Yeah.
whatever.
I know.
It's a tough,
Yep.
I feel like it's a tough, place we live in. And the irony to me is in just noticing in neighborhoods,
Mm-hmm.
um, and of course, this isn't research place. It's completely anecdotal, right? Like when I was a kid, I lived in neighborhoods where, you would run from one lawn to another, and, like you knew these parents. It was part of like a village kind of thing.
Yep.
And as you move up in that socioeconomic ladder, now, like, I live in a place where everybody has their own gate and,
Yeah.
their own
Yeah.
fortress,
Yeah.
and, there's nothing but play dates and stuff like that. So society, and is as much progress we're making, we're having some problems in
Yeah.
that some of this progress is moving us in directions that are not natural for us. And I think the point of this entire episode is that, you know, focus in on your social life, your social relationships. Make sure that you have a purpose. People talk about retirement all the time. You hear people talking about wanting to retire, but then they retire and they have nothing to do and they die.
Yeah.
I mean,
No, I
it's,
agree.
yeah.
And I can tell you from an internal medicine standpoint, again, anecdotally, my experiences with patients, depression and isolation are very high, very prevalent as we age. And really, the patients that I have, that I have had, that I've come across, that are thriving in their 80s, 90s, and plus, are those that really do kind of find that holy grail to life. And it's social connectedness. It's the
Right.
really tight circles. It's the friends. And, obviously we all navigate through this differently throughout our lives. Some people are more hermits, I would say, than others. But I think the things that really do bring us joy as humans, and this is just inherent in our DNA, is connecting socially.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, you want to be mindful of broad kind of overview statements. Some people might disagree, but um, does money bring you happiness? Maybe short term. What does bring you happiness? But I can say ubiquitously, the social relationships really do
Yeah.
sustain happiness.
Ben, executive producer Ben.
Mm-hmm.
What questions do you have on this? I mean, we're certainly, neither one of us is a psychiatrist. Neither one of us has a huge knowledge base on this, but we've done a little bit of background work on this.
Yeah.
What questions, if any, come up to you?
As far as kids go, you touched on the whole gate thing, comparing how I grew up, how you grew
Yeah.
up, where you could just run to your neighbors
Right.
and ride your bike around. I guess what are the implications of this whole gate mentality, the play date mentality, where you're just shuttling kids to appointments with their
Well,
friends?
here's another question for you. Maybe you would
Yeah.
know this. I know you're not a pediatrician, but I mean, certainly the childhood obesity is going up as well. It's not just the gates either, right? Like there's also the cyber gate, right? There's this whole idea of the, when we were kids, we didn't have cell phones, and we didn't, weren't like gaming and social media all the time. We were like, get home, put your stuff down, run out, and figure out where the game was, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's really not it. So I feel like there's those are analogous situations: the physical gate, and then this gate that we've created through technology.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if you look at what's happening with children, there's a obesity epidemic, right? I mean, that goes
Without
back to
doubt.
nutrition as well, but a tremendous,
I agree.
a lot of inactivity.
Yeah. And, so you're raising an important question. It's really hard to tease apart like what begets what.
Right.
But the obesity epidemic, you can argue, is nutrition. But you can also argue that inflammation and high cortisol begets certain cravings, which begets problems with nutrition. Or high cortisol, high inflammatory markers beget poor sleep, which begets metabolic dysfunction, right? So it's all kind of intertwined.
It's all intertwined, and also screen time, right? And blue light at night, and cortisol levels there. It's just a big mess. And I think that's the overlying. I think that's the overriding theme, is that all the things that we're like sort of moving towards for society are all things, technology wise, and that are not good for us, right? Screens are
Powerful.
not good for us. Zoom is great because you don't need office space, but now you don't have to interact with your, fellow employees all day long, which is like
Yeah.
actually not a good thing.
Yeah.
It's not a good thing. So yeah, that's what I would say. And I think with the kids, I think I only wonder what the long-term implications of a lot of this are. And it's funny sometimes, especially right after COVID, I remember seeing, my kids, and that they would, like have play dates, or I'd pick them up, right? Like pick up friends, and they would sit next to each other in the car, and they'd both have their phones. Like they wouldn't even talk to each other,
Yeah,
right?
I know.
So
Yeah.
weird. But I think the
Yeah.
long-term implications of that to me are frightening.
I agree. I mean, and we don't know what the long term is. I mean, this is new technology.
Yeah.
But I will say that I find it extremely fascinating that you're going to have technology which is designed to bridge people,
Yeah.
to connect humans, and yet you can do it in an isolated
Yeah.
lack of
Well, because I
connectedness.
don't think you get the same oxytocin release from a text.
And that's spot on. I mean,
Right?
physiologically, things are different.
Yeah. Anything else, Ben?
As you get older and stuff like that, is there anything in the studies that talk about what is a quality relationship?
Yeah, there's subjectivity there.
Yeah.
And without question.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Ellen was talking about is these surveys that they do for some way, and I know exactly how they validate them. They give them some scientific significance on the way that they're answered. So again, it is a much softer science than we're accustomed to, and certainly not something that like I'm really
Yeah.
good at or
I know.
whatever. But I think there's enough evidence, both objectively through these studies and also through these blue zones where you see, these cultures where they really like involve the elderly, they live longer, So anyway, I think that wraps it up for our pillars. Ellen,
Yeah.
it's been great going through those, and I'm sure we'll do a number of other shows
Oh, yeah.
together, but thank you very much for, running
Thanks,
through all
buddy.
these things with me. And
Oh, yeah.
and then until next time,
Thank you, my friend.
thanks for joining
Thanks for having me.
Sapio, and we'll see you next week.